Good singing. You may be seated. For those of you who don't know, I was raised a pastor's kid and in a Methodist church, and so these hymns that we sing on the holidays are all very, very familiar to me. And I had forgotten this, but we used to have two services on a Sunday morning. And what I like to do during that song is when it said the vilest offender, I would point to the person next to me. And then in the next line, I would put their name as being forgiven. So I had forgotten I did that. I was a bit of a stinker. Pastors' kids have it tough sometimes. If there's any pastors' kids here, I just want to say I'm with you. We can start a support group. I'm in recovery. It's going well. So it's a tough job description. Hey, if you are following along, if you're a person who likes to know where we are in the sermon or you're a note taker, there are sermon notes at the end of every row. You can snag one of those. We have been reading through the Gospel of Mark this spring, and we are up to Mark chapter 5. So if you're using the blue Bibles that we have in the sanctuary, it's page 1558, and then we're going to continue on to page 1559. This is Mark chapter 5. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. There Jesus got out of the boat. A man with an evil spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Swear to God that you won't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you evil spirit." Then Jesus said, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on a nearby hill. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the evil spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this to the town and countryside. And the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in the right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had been told, the people, what happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him go, but said, "Go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. Some of you are thinking, "Pastor, this is a very strange passage for Easter. Are you aware that we have visitors who haven't been a part of the Mark series up to this point, and this is the first thing they're hearing?" I am aware, and I hope you trust me, I know what I'm doing. Because this is a very strange story. I want to give you some background. So, up to this point in the story, Jesus has been wandering around mostly inside Judea, Israel. And he has been gathering around him a misfit lot of followers that he's calling the disciples. They will eventually become the apostles. And he is training them how to do ministry. He's empowering them to do it. And he's trying to get them ready to be without him. And so there's a weight to his time with them. He's mentoring them, but he's also letting them do the ministry. Sometimes they do it well, and sometimes they don't do it well. The other thing that's going on is that there's a lot of conflict. In fact, behind the scenes, Jesus's religious adversaries and his political adversaries, normally who do not get along and do not cooperate, have made a little treaty, a little pact behind the scenes that they're going to try and get rid of this Jesus character. And this is especially obviously important because in the events that we just celebrated in Easter week, they ended up pairing with the occupying military force that had this thing called the cross, and that they made an example out of Jesus. So it ended up, the plot worked, but that's been happening behind the scenes. So we come to this text, and I will tell you that until about 10 years ago, I only knew of one way to read this story. I had been raised reading the Bible in Sunday school and in youth group and then in Bible college when I got a call to ministry. And I had ever only been presented with one way to read this story, which I'm calling the straightforward reading. That's what people call it. Some people call it a plain reading of the text, or maybe they try and say a literal reading of the text. I'm calling it a straightforward reading. So we're gonna enter into the text and we're gonna walk it through, and we're just gonna take a minute to do a straightforward reading. So in this story, there are some fantastical elements to the story. So it's worth noting that in the Gospels, Jesus only verbally confronts evil spirits twice. Both are in Mark. The first time we read about in chapter 1, when Jesus did it in Jewish territory. Now he has crossed over the sea and he's in Gentile territory, non-Jewish territory. And he does this thing again where he verbally confronts a spirit. So that's worth noting, because as Mark is storytelling, there's some mirroring going on, that all the things that Jesus did in the first 4 chapters here in Mark, he now has crossed over to the other side of the sea, and he's going to do that exact same thing in nearly that exact same pattern. So Mark is definitely setting us up to see that this is sort of how Jesus goes, and now he's outside of Israel, outside of Jewish territory, he's doing this same thing. And so it's just worth noting that Mark, as a storyteller, is using some mirroring, okay? The second thing that's interesting is that for the Jewish people, this story would have been really troubling on several levels. One, hogs were unclean. They were, you couldn't eat pork, you couldn't raise it. And so there's just an uncleanness about these pig farmers and this whole story. And the second thing is that this man had been living in a graveyard. That's another, for the Jewish people, another symbol of uncleanness, right? So this story has 2 layers of uncleanness going on at the same time. This man who has been tormented by these evil spirits knows apparently who Jesus is, that the spirits know Jesus' authority or his power, his identity. And he comes out and he confronts, and then we just read the story and you see how it goes. And so in a plain reading of the text, we have to admit that there are some issues that need to be addressed, some questions that need to be addressed. Mostly regarding this pig fiasco, this whole thing that happens with them. So people who have a plain reading of the text, a straightforward reading, there are some questions that are sometimes difficult to answer. For instance, why would Jesus be okay with killing 2,000 pigs, right, just to set one person free, right? It's a weird part of the story. Because Jesus had cast out evil spirits before, and no animals were injured in the making of that movie, So it seems unnecessary. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the fact that Jesus has anything to do with this guy who lives in the graveyard and these pig farmers and their pigs would have made any Jewish listener very uncomfortable. But the thing that troubles me the most is that Jesus ruined some farmers' entire livelihood, right? Economically would have devastated this, not just the man, right? But he clearly had workers. So for this entire outfit, it would have been an economic disaster. It's a really bizarre part of the story, especially when you consider that raising pigs would have been something that happened on that east side of the shore. And there's two things that are good to know. One is the town that Mark names here, the Gerasenes, is actually about 30 miles southeast of the shore. So it's weird that he names it as a territory because it's not exactly located on the shore, okay? The second thing is that there was a town nearby that Herod Antipas, the ruler, had built a city as sort of a monument to himself that was called Tiberias. And it would have needed a lot of food imported, right? So these pigs were probably being raised for either the Roman army or the city of Tiberias, right? This Gentile city. And so not only would this person have lost their entire livelihood in losing that much livestock, but there would have been real implications because they probably were contracted to raise those hogs for either the Roman military or the town of Tiberias. So there would have been severe consequences for losing that many livestock, okay? So in the straightforward reading, one of the things that people try and take away from it is, like, if we see somebody who is, struggling with being possessed by evil spirits or is tormented like this, or as many have said with now that we have mental hospitals and psychology, that this supernatural strength, right, to break chains, that if you try and do a straightforward reading, what happens is some people try and take this as a game plan, sort of a how-to manual of how to deal with that situation, and I have seen that go very, very wrong, especially when they try and get the evil spirit to name itself, to make itself vulnerable by giving its name. And I just think that there's a caution to be had with, even if this story, if you read it in a straightforward way, it's not a template to be replicated. It's not a model for ministry. So I just wanted to say that. About 10 years ago, I was made aware that there's a different way to read some of these biblical texts. And the way that I came into it was to be presented with the idea that Jesus told parables, right? One of the most famous parables is the Good Samaritan. And we're pretty good at reading parables, right? Like, all of us know that the point, what we're supposed to take away from the parable of the Good Samaritan, is not that we're supposed to dress up like foreigners or Samaritans and wander up and down the highway looking for people who have been beat up, right? That's not a literal application of that. That when a parable, and at the end, the person who presents the parable, in this case Jesus, says, go and do likewise, the story didn't have to be literal. Like, no one thinks that the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's not a newspaper account of a literal story, right? It's a parable. It's supposed to teach us a lesson. So apparently things don't have to be literal for them to be truthful. Something can be presented to us and the presenter can say, go and do likewise. And we don't say, well, can I talk to this Samaritan? I want to interview the guy who was beat up, right? We don't get into arguments about the facticity of a parable. We know not to do that. It's a moral story, and so when we're told go and do likewise, we're pretty good at taking away sort of the lesson of the parable. We know, like, okay, so we're supposed to be kind and caretakers and to reach out to those who are in need, even if they're very different from us, and even if we've been taught that their people are not our people, even if they vote a different way than we do, or they are, hold a different perspective on this hot button issue, or they come from a different country, or, right, we know that the story of the Good Samaritan, what the moral is and what we're supposed to do with it. Well, the idea that was presented to me is that in the same way that Jesus taught his disciples using parables, that his disciples used parables to teach us about Jesus. I'm going to say it again. In the same way that Jesus used parables to teach his disciples used parables to teach us about Jesus. So in this parabolic reading, right, this story, we are invited not to get in an argument about the details of the story, about the factual nature of like where it was located and why did this happen and this and that, right? That there's something that is happening in the way Mark is telling this story that we're supposed to hear, right? And it's more than the straightforward reading, that there's something bigger going on in the way that Mark is telling this. So I'm not saying these events didn't happen. I'm not arguing about any of that. I'm saying that in the way Mark is teaching us, if you read this parabolically, as a parable, it gets really interesting. Let me give you a couple examples. So Jesus crosses over the sea, which represents chaos and sort of uncontrolled. That's what the sea poetically represented, right? This big body of water, it represented a loss of control or terror, right? It was when the seas were stormy, it was terrifying. And so there's this uncontrolled nature that he crosses over, and he goes to this Gentile place, and he is confronted by somebody who is in bondage, right? Who is chained up. And it turns out that when Jesus finally gets this tormenting presence to say its name, because it already knew Jesus' name, it turns out that its name is the name of the Roman military, Legion. It's a formation. It's a Roman military formation. And Mark throws in an extra bonus because when he talks about the herd of pigs, it's sort of something that's interesting is that it's not the right word because pigs aren't in herds. That's not the word we use for pigs, right? It is, however, the word that the Romans used for new recruits to the military. So Mark's doing a double play on words. So the spirit, the demon's name is Legion, the name of the Roman army formation. And in exchange, what's being offered are these new recruits to the military. So Mark is definitely sort of winking at us in his storytelling. And so Jesus liberates this man who has been tormented and held captive. He liberates him by sending these unclean spirits into these unclean animals who rush down the cliff and plunge themselves in the sea and die in the waters. Now, if you were a first century hearer of this story, one of the things that would come to your mind is that you have a story in your Jewish Testament called the Exodus. And in the Exodus, the people of God are delivered across dry land, and they are pursued by a military that had held them captive, right, in Egypt, and that the sea swallows the military pursuers and delivers them to victory. You would have that in your mind, not only is it weird that the demon's name is the Roman military, but then by casting it into this herd of unclean pigs, and then this suicidal march, like lemmings down into the sea, in the same way that the Egyptians pursuing the people of God, the Israelites, were swallowed by the Red Sea, these pigs are drowned in this sea. You would say, all right, Mark's telling us some type of a deliverance story. Mark's telling us an Exodus story, that there is liberation is being hinted at and deliverance from this foreign occupying military presence that torments the people of God. I like this parabolic reading. There's so many layers of imagery and symbolism that Mark has tucked in here that it's really fascinating not to get bogged down in the details of the straightforward reading, like about this poor guy's entire livelihood being drowned because Jesus wanted in exchange for one guy's freedom, right? Stuff like that. The parabolic reading not only releases us from getting bogged down in those details, but it calls us to say there's something more going on in Jesus' ministry than just the deliverance of one person. In a parable reading, that one person is a stand-in for something much bigger, the people of God maybe, or people who are oppressed and chained up, bound by these tormenting demonic forces. And there's a hint at liberation in the Egypt narrative, and that Mark is getting us ready for a new kind of Exodus story. In the same way that God delivered God's people out of Egypt, that God is going to deliver God's people from this present captivity. Let me tell you why I love this parabolic reading. Today is Easter, and Easter is one of those times where we're really good at picking up on the imagery and the symbolism and knowing that there's something bigger, right, going on. I love this guy named Paul Ricoeur. He was a philosopher of religion, and he had this idea called the surplus of meaning. That in any text, whether it's the Bible or the communion table or our hymns, in any text, there's more going on than we can possibly explain or contain or diagram or exhaust. There is a surplus of meaning, layers and layers and layers of meaning. And for me, the surplus of meaning never rings more true than at Easter. When we get to say things like, life conquered death, that life continues after death, that death does not have the final word, and that death has no victory over life. That's a parabolic reading of Easter. And I love it because we don't get bogged down in details of the Easter story like, wait a minute, hold on. So when they showed up, so the stone had been rolled away. Who rolled it away? And you just get to say, it's not the point of the story. And they're like, wait, did somebody steal his body? No. The text never says that. What's the text say? He's not here. It's this ambiguous, sort of mysterious, he's not here. The one you're looking for, not here. Right, but our scientific mind is like, yeah, but what about this and what about that? But in a parabolic reading, you're released from that straightforward, the problems that you find in the text, into saying, what am I supposed to hear in this story? And today on Easter, we have a gift of this text of this holiday that reminds us every spring when the days get a little longer, right? And the sun, it greets us in the morning. We have this cultural and religious reminder: life goes on. Life is good. Death is not the victor. It doesn't have the final word. That life continues past death is a fantastic surplus of meaning that we have yet to explore all the way and will never exhaust. And it gives me great joy on days like this to say there is hope. The grave is not the period at the end of your sentence. It is just the close of one chapter that opens into your next chapter of life. We are invited to be an Easter people who live in the light and the goodness of God's love, knowing that no level of oppression, of torment, of illness, of disappointment, of struggle can have victory over the hope that is for us in what God provides. And that's good news. So I'm going to give you a second. I'm going to ask you, if you're using the sermon outlines, there's a place where if you can write down your questions. If you want the question to make it to me, you can use your yellow pew card and put it in the offering plate. But the bell choir is going to come and minister to us in song.